Heavenly Father, we beseech Thee. I kneel before You as a member of this age-old craft, praying to You for guidance as I am on a journey for more light, but more especially light that has been lost, forgotten, or hidden among the ages gone by. The light that connects us with our very meaning and informs us of our purpose. Light locked deep within our past, beyond lips that no longer speak, and paths forgotten, no longer traveled. Aid me in my pursuit, Lord, for historical light. Hey everybody, welcome back to Historical Light, a new independent Masonic show focused on the historical events and aspects within Freemasonry. I'm your host, Brother Alex Powers, and I want to thank you for joining us again on our quest for Historical Light. So our introduction episode released last week and it went over really well. I've gotten a lot of comments in from brothers giving some really encouraging words and letting us know that they really appreciate the efforts behind the show and that they're really excited for what's to come. I want to express how thankful I am for that and that I too am very excited for what's to come with this show. So with that said, let's jump over to MasonryToday.com and see what happened today in Masonic history. So on today's date in Masonic history, we're covering the date of birth of Richard Ewing Powell. Brother Powell was an American entertainer. Powell was born on November 14, 1904 in Mountain View, Arkansas. When he was 10, his family moved to Little Rock. In Little Rock, he sang in church choirs and local orchestras. He also started his own band. He attended the Little Rock College before launching his own career as an entertainer. He joined various bands and in the late 1920s signed a recording contract with a company that would later become part of Warner Brothers in 1930. Warner Brothers was impressed with Powell's singing ability and his stage performance. He had emceed for a time in a theater. The studio began casting Powell for various roles, all the roles having in common that the character was a singer of some kind. Many of the films were musicals with choreography. Some of his early films were referred to as pre-code movies. Pre-code movies were films that were created after the start of sound pictures and before the motion picture production code, as a set of moral guidelines for the making of motion pictures. By 1940, Powell was ready to leave Warner Brothers. He was interested in more dramatic roles and roles that did not include him singing. So Powell bought out his contract with Warner Brothers. By 1944, Powell felt he was too old to be a romantic leading man, so began to try to branch out. One of the roles that he first tried for and lost, he lost to Fred McMurray. Instead of frustrating him, this proved to Powell that he could reinvent himself. This was also the end of his singing roles in films. Later in 1944, he was cast to play Detective Philip Marlowe. Powell was the first person to play the character by name in a film. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Powell branched out into radio and then into television. It was also in the 1950s that Powell was one of the founders of the company 4-Star Television. This would later branch out to 4-Star Films. In 1956, Powell directed the film The Conqueror, which starred John Wayne as Genghis Khan. The film production took place in St. George, Utah, which was downwind of the United States above-ground atomic testing. The cast and crew totaled 220. By 1981, 91 of them had developed some form of cancer. 46, including John Wayne and Powell, passed away from cancer. Powell passed away on January 2, 1963. Powell was a member of Ascot Lodge 538 in Los Angeles, California. So thank you again to our friends over at MasonryToday.com for that, and definitely check out their page and subscribe so you can keep up with that great Masonic history they're putting out on a daily basis. So the topic for today's show is the Liverpool Masonic Rebellion of 1823. We're extremely grateful to have had the chance to interview an expert on the subject, Dr. and Brother David Harrison, who is from Liverpool, has done an amazing amount of research and even written a great book on it. So before we go in, a little disclaimer, with this being our very first interview, we did happen to run into some audio audio issues. You can still hear everything fine, but we had some background noise pop up. We think we got that taken care of, so it shouldn't be an issue in any further episodes. Just ask that you give us a little slack on this one, and we'll definitely get better as time goes on. With that said, I hope you enjoyed today's interview. Hey everybody, welcome back to Historical Light. We're pleased to have our guest today, Dr. and Brother David Harrison. Brother David, I'm going to hand it over to you, if you don't mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your background.
Thank you, Alex. My name is Dr. David Harrison, and I've been a Freemason for nearly 20 years under the United Grand Lodge of England, and I did a PhD, which I successfully defended back in 2008. That was on the history of Freemasonry, history of English Freemasonry, and that became my first book with Liverpool Masonic called The Genesis of Freemasonry. And from there, it's snowballed really. I've had 8 books out, and it's going really well. Fascinating journey, researching Masonry and all different aspects. Can't even say it now. All different aspects of Freemasonry, and it's really interesting journey.
Wow, that's very impressive. So first of all, what brought you to Freemasonry? Did you have family history, or what was it that actually introduced you to coming into Freemasonry?
I was. I later discovered that I had a great grandfather who was a Freemason in the same lodge that I'm in now, which is quite strange. I only actually discovered that when I just became a Freemason, and that was back in 1998. And so that was probably about 1845 or something like that. So there's been a bit of a gap in my family being Masons, but apart from that, I've met a few local people that have known family and things like that, but yeah, I'm probably the first of the generation for a good 150 years or so. So.
Very cool, very cool. We're glad you did. You've obviously brought a wealth of knowledge to the fraternity, and we're so glad that you made that leap. So, what was it that brought you into being so hooked and interested in the history of Freemasons? Brought you to write 8 books and get your doctorate in Freemasonry? That's pretty impressive.
It was by accident, really. I never envisioned being a historian or a writer. I was a musician in the 90s, in the 1990s. I was in a band, and that was my creative streak, really. And at the same time, I'd gone to university and I'd done history. And when the band collapsed, if you like, fell apart, I just carried on with the history, and I wanted to be an archaeologist, so I tried my hand at archaeology, and that was very, very badly paid, really, so I kind of moved on from there, and I thought, I'll become a teacher, become a lecturer, so I did an MA, and I was successful at the MA, and the University of Liverpool asked me to do a PhD, and I thought, that's okay, I'll do that. And they wanted something that was new and cutting edge, really, as all PhDs are. And at the same time, I just joined Freemasonry, and I suggested about the history of Freemasonry, and they said, yeah, that's great, it's fantastic, yeah, we've never had that before. So that's how it started, really. And that was in the year 2000 when I started the PhD. Did it part-time, and I was a teacher and a lecturer at the same time, and passed that in 2008. So I finally got the PhD then. So that opened a new career, really.
All right, very cool. Well, that is definitely a great feat, you coming out with 8 books. One of those books has a subject matter of what we're going to be discussing tonight with the Masonic Rebellion of 1823. Brother, if you wouldn't mind, tell us a little bit about that matter.
The Liverpool Masonic Rebellion of 1823. It was a reaction against the Union of 1813, where the ancients and the moderns had been brought together. English Freemasonry was supposedly healed, if you like. This obviously caused a bit of a reaction against some die-hard lodges, that were used to doing it their own way, their own particular way. Because one of the things that was brought in by the Union was the Duke of Sussex, who was the Grand Master of the time. He was quite stern in his opinions, and he wanted it uniform, really. The ritual to be standardised. The administration was going to be changed. The dues went up as well, which a lot of lodges weren't happy with. They've got to pay a bit extra now, for Freemasonry. So there was a lot of problems really that arose from the Union, and one of the centres really of discontent was in Lancashire, which was in the northwest of England. That's where I'm from, and in particular Liverpool. And Lancashire at the time was the industrial heartland of England, and that's where all the cotton mills were, all the the majority of the mines, if you like, the coal mines. There was Liverpool was one of the main ports that imported cotton from the southern states, and that cotton obviously went to the textile mills of Manchester and Warrington and Wigan, Rochdale, places like that. So the area had suffered a lot of discontent over the past decades. The late 18th century, early 19th century were particularly hard for the area, and there was a lot of poverty as well. So the whole aspect of the Liverpool Masonic Rebellion crosses over to social history, really, local history, which is something that I like as well. In Liverpool, there was a Mason called Michael Alexander Gage, and he really instigated the rebellion. He was the firebrand, if you like, and he was complaining about all kinds of things, really. One of the main things as well was that the Royal Arch, which was classed as a fourth degree by the ancients, was now kind of declassified, if you like, to become the completion of the third. And so that still created a bit of an argument. And one of the things that Michael Alexander Gage wrote about was how this was causing upset. Some of the Liverpool rebels and in addition some of the Wigan lodges as well joined the rebellion, and they wrote a letter to the Duke of Sussex. And legend has it that he read this letter and he just threw it on the fire or something. Typical kind of view of aristocracy and the royal family, and at the time. And so this led to even more rebelliousness, if you like, because they didn't receive a reply. So all of this complaining really just got them nowhere. So there was all kinds of things going on in Liverpool. There was Michael Alexander Gage and his cohorts were suspended, and so that didn't help either. And a lot of lodges supported him. They thought it was outrageous that he'd been suspended, for no main apparent reason apart from just complaining, So eventually things got worse and worse, and in 1823 they created the ancient Grand Lodge again, and so this is where you get this independent Grand Lodge that formed, which now would be probably classed as a clandestine Grand Lodge. So you can imagine how people would have felt about that,
Sure.
What the rebellion caused really was a Grand Lodge that was on its own, that was isolated, and acted as like a time capsule, really, because they were still working a table lodge, which was something that was consigned to history then. You know, I mean, that's something of the 18th century, really, you know, in English terms. So they became this ancient time capsule, if you like, that still practice all these old-fashioned ways of Freemasonry, which in some circles has become known as the Wigan tradition, because what happened just a few years after the rebellion in 1823 was that there was a fallout between the Liverpool Brethren and the Wigan Brethren, mainly over the fact that there was a Liverpool brother who was Grand Secretary, and he ran off with the money. So that didn't go down very well, and caused a massive fallout. And
I would imagine so.
Yeah, and a bit of a split. So basically, the Grand Lodge moved to Wigan, and like on a permanent basis, and so it continued to meet in Wigan till 1913. So it can be said that the rebellion really lasted 90 years, you know, from 1823 to 1913. And one of the difficulties I had with the book really was convincing the publisher that it wasn't just about local history. There was more of an international interest in this, because it reflects how the Union really wasn't just a simple harmonious event, you know, where in 1813 ancients and moderns came together and life was all harmony, and it wasn't like that at all. You know, there was a lot of lodges in various parts of the country as well that didn't like the new ideas that were coming through, and especially the ritual changes and the administrational changes. And one thing about Lancashire is that it's probably the largest province in England at the time. In the United Grand Lodge of England, we have provinces that are more or less kind of structured on the county basis, really.
Okay.
And the Lancashire province was one of the largest, and probably one of the most populated, because it was obviously the heartland of the Industrial Revolution. So a lot of the the major industrial centres there were completely crowded by that time. You know, Liverpool with its courts and the disease and poverty that was going on, and then Manchester as well, and Wigan and Warrington and places like that, Rochdale, Preston, Blackburn, all these big industrial centres, you know. So one of the things that the rebellion caused was that the Lancashire province was split between East and West, which it still is today, which is interesting. And the United Grand Lodge of England kind of backed off the enforcement of ritual, you know, and allowed the lodges to do it their own particular way, as long as it stayed within the framework of the United Grand Lodge of England. So you get all these wonderful styles of ritual that some of them still exist in England, like the Bottomley ritual, which is associated with Liverpool Masonry, and the Humber usage, the Humber use, which is over in the northeast in Hull. You've got the York working, which is based in York, Bristol working. You've got all kinds of weird and wonderful little rituals. You know, there's local. You know, I could be here all night just reeling them all off. You know.
Oh, definitely. And
yeah,
I've actually came through a few of those rituals, and they're almost like lost rites to a degree, because you don't see them much today, and you go through them, and there's so much history in there. It's very cool to kind of bring those back to life.
Yeah, I mean, over the past decade or so, you know, I mean, Freemasonry. I think this has happened in the United States as well, as declined in numbers. You know, so a lot of lodges are closed, and some of these rituals are not practiced anymore. There's one called the Nigerian ritual, which was she's still going in a few lodges. There's Carlisle's ritual, which was named after Richard Carlisle, who was the radical who was at Peterloo massacre in Manchester in 1819, and he basically kind of got all the rituals together and published it as a book. And even though he wasn't a Freemason, his ritual became very popular because it was quite easily obtained, and it went into a number of editions. But there's, to my knowledge anyway, there's no lodges practicing the Carlisle ritual anymore, which is, it's got those little bits that are completely different and eccentric, which makes it really nice.
Sure.
So the Liverpool Masonic Rebellion really had quite an effect, and there was about 5 or so lodges that were involved. One of the lodges definitely practiced the table lodge. We know that for sure, which was a complete eccentricity in Freemasonry during the 19th century in England. And there was one particular lodge that actually met outside. They met under a bridge by a canal in Wigan, and the reason for that was, I think, that they were meeting in an inn that was by the bridge, and they hadn't paid their the fees to the landlord, the rent to the landlord, so basically threw them out, and they started meeting under a bridge, which is completely bizarre. And apparently they had 2 tilers, one at either end of the bridge, underneath the bridge, so no one could walk past.
That is very cool.
Absolutely bizarre. Yeah, and again, that to my knowledge is one of the only English lodges that actually worked outside. And I know you get a few lodges in America that do work outside, because obviously the weather's could be nicer there, and over here we get rain all the time, so.
Yeah, sure. Well, you work with what you got, right?
This is it. And under a bridge when it's raining, why not?
There you go. Well, with the differences between the ancient and modern lodges, what would you say was the main differences between the two that would bring them to actually come to a rebellion with their decisions?
There was a lot of differences, really. There was one of the main ones was the Royal Arch. The ancients saw that as a separate degree, a 4th degree, really.
Mm-hmm.
Where the moderns only saw it as like a completion of the 3rd, and this was a big argument, really. There was a big difference there. There was all kinds of different ways of practicing the administration. For example, like the ancient lodges, they could have a warrant, and then they could move around with that warrant. So like for example, there was a lodge in Stockport called the Lodge of St John that had been working in Yorkshire over the border for a while and kind of come back, and that had moved around, and modern lodges didn't really tend to do that. They stayed where they were.
Right.
So there was different practices, and the ritual obviously was different back then. I mean, you get even today in England, it's probably the same in the United States, where you go to different lodges, and this is the way that we do it. Back then it was probably a bit more, kind of a bit more worse than that.
Definitely.
Yeah,
and that was one of the things that threw me off coming into Masonry. Kind of the interpretation of it I had is everybody has always used the same ritual word by word by word, and I'm saying the same words that George Washington did, for example. And then the first time I got to travel was just, I'm in Kansas. Missouri is just not too far from me. I visited a lodge just in Missouri. It's under a different Grand Lodge, and the difference is not huge, but just enough. You're like, whoa, what? That's different.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I can totally understand.
That's right. That's right. I mean, like a table lodge, for example. I mean, we know that the Lodge of Sincerity, which was the main lodge in the Wigan Grand Lodge, which became which kind of developed from the Liverpool Masonic Rebellion. They were practicing this table lodge because we've got a painting of it, and it's completely bizarre to look at it. You know, they used to work around the lodge, work around the table. You know. To comprehend that kind of thing, you know, it's quite bizarre. And there was all kinds of other things as well. There was you know, slightly different symbolism, and of course when the union happened, a lot of the symbolism changed anyway. You know, there was like for example in my lodge now, which is called the Lodge of Light, which meets in Warrington, very old lodge. 250 years old this year. They still use for the deacons the jewel is Mercury with caduceus, you know, the rod with the snake, and they're still allowed to use that because they were formed before the union. Any lodge that was founded after the union have to wear a dove. So there's slight little differences like that. So you can imagine, you know, people in lodges at the time thinking, oh, I can't believe this. You know, how dare they tell us that we can't use one of them? You know, how dare, sure. You know, and this is how it works. You know, so and the thing with Michael Alexander Gage, who was the leading firebrand of the rebellion, his writings, there's a lot of his writings that survive. He was a very, very intelligent man, a beautiful letter writer. You know, I mean, his handwriting is beautiful, and he was into all kinds of things. You know, he was into you know, kind of scientific things, and he was a map maker, a cartographer. Really? And he drew this beautiful map of Liverpool as Liverpool was developing in the 1830s, and it's very, very intricate. And even today, you know, in auction, you know, original copy fetches thousands. You know, it's a beautiful work of art. But he comes across in his writings as a very aggressive. Almost kind of, I don't want to use the word nasty, but very aggressive, and you know, you can imagine him standing up and being very, quite violent in a way. You know, I get this image of him where he's quite a bit of a bully, I think. Right. And he'd stand up and he'd you know, tell people what he thought. You know, and that comes across in his writings a lot. In fact, later on, he left Freemasonry in the 1840s. He effectively rebelled against the rebels in the 1840s because he completely disagreed with the way the Wigan Grand Lodge was going, and they'd renumbered lodges, and they became like lodge number 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, this kind of thing, and he believed that the old numbers should have been kept. So something trivial like that really set him off, you know. And that was one thing about the union, the 1813 union, was that a lot of the numbers were changed, the lodge numbers were changed, to obviously bring in, you know, another Grand Lodge and merge with the modern Grand Lodge. You know, you had to restructure everything, and for the administrational purposes, you know, a lot of lodges became, you know, just renumbered, and it must have been a big job, really, you know, to get all these new lodges in, and you know, all the paperwork, for example, you know, the bureaucracy of it.
Definitely. With that, have you seen any loss in history because of the merging of the Grand Lodges and all the differences in the paperwork and everything? For example, I've been doing a lot of family history, trying to, you know, trace back family members that were in Masonry. I have my great-great-grandfather that was a member of a lodge in Oklahoma. that back in the time was not the state of Oklahoma yet. It was Indian Territory, and they had the Grand Lodge of Indian Territory. Well, you also had the Grand Lodge of Arkansas that chartered some lodges within that state. And then I believe it was in 1906 that it all converted over to the Grand Lodge of Oklahoma. And it seems to me that just a lot of information was lost through that time, and reasonably so within small towns and stuff. Do you see any of the same in this situation with the merging of history being lost between any of these lodges?
There's quite a lot of lodges that do disappear around that time. It was also a very kind of rough time for Freemasonry in England at that particular point, because as I've mentioned in my second book, which was called The Transformation of Freemasonry, which is all about Freemasonry in the 19th century, there was an act passed in 1799 called the Secret Societies Act, and this is all about the wars with France and the revolution that occurred in France, and it was William Pitt the Younger that brought it in, and it was like a knee-jerk reaction, but it affected Freemasonry because they then had to make a list of every lodge had to make a list of its membership, and because it was tainted with revolution as well. We've done a bit of studying with this, myself and another Masonic historian called John Belton. And we looked at a lot of lodge lists, and a lot of the lodges lose members in the early 19th century. The members just dips totally. There's a lot of lodges, especially in the industrial areas, where you've had a lot of radicalism and you've had a lot of revolt and machine breakers, and I talked about the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester.
Sure.
Where a group of there was thousands of people just gathering together. It's basically what we'd call a rally today, and they were cotton workers, and they were talking about how hard it was in the mills, because children working in the mills, getting trapped in the machines. They were working long hours. The pay was terrible, and what happened was they sent the militia, the local militia, and quite a number of people got killed. So it became like the Peterloo Massacre, named after the Waterloo Battle of Waterloo, which was just a number of years before.
Right.
So the Northwest really had seen a lot of working men, that wanting to get involved in trade unions, which were because of the Combination Acts, which was another act by the government, a series of acts by the government that had been brought in. They started to join Freemasonry, and we found evidence of all these working men that suddenly popped up in lodges. And the lodge that I'm in now, the Lodge of Lights, which was founded in 1765, this had, until that time, had merchants in and local industrialists and people like that. And then when you get to the early 19th century, you see a lot of working men coming in, like cotton spinners and things like that, and labourers and fustian cutters. Fustian was the they made sails out of fustian, so that was a big industry, especially by the Mersey, the River Mersey, for the ships and things. And that's where my great grandfather comes into play, because he worked in the cotton mills. He was just a working man, and he joined Freemasonry then. So that's my connection with it, really. And but there was a lot of people like him, that were just working men. They worked in the mills, they went into lodges, and you see in places like Warrington, Wigan, Oldham, the old mill towns in Yorkshire as well. So a lot of working men joined, and then by the time you get to the 1850s, it changes again. You see a lot of middle class joining there. So,
sure.
But yeah, there's going back to your earlier question, yeah, there's a lot of lodges that just disappear, and basically, the short on members and the close.
Definitely. Well, with your modern beliefs on Freemasonry, your personal journey, if you were alive in that time period, which way do you think you would have gone? Would you have gone with the rebellion, or would you have stayed with the ancients?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, well, I think with the rebellion, I've always wondered if Michael Alexander Gage's kind of bullying and aggressive nature forced a lot of people to follow him, and I've often wondered about that, and I'm not in, any bullies or anything like that. I kind of react, in a kind of, I fight the bullies type thing, so
Sure.
It's weird, it's strange. So even though they were standing up for what they believed in, which was to keep the ritual and to keep the the Royal Arch as a separate degree or whatever, or the administration, they were standing up for what they were believed in. There was a bit of a class structure going on as well at the time. It reflects that typical English kind of class war, if you like, because these were lower end of the scale tradesmen. They were landlords and like Michael Alexander Gage. He was a very clever man, but he was only working at the time. I think he was apprenticed to a tailor for a time. So he was working as a tailor. It was only later that he became a cartographer and got into engineering, and career change for him. There was kind of lower end trades, the high street trade. So they were. I can see it as a class battle in a way, because they were fighting the aristocracy, the Duke of Sussex,
Sure.
and his friends, that were based down in London, and really, Gage's writing, he wrote something called the Magna Carta of Masonic Freedom, which reflects, the Magna Carta, and it's a beautiful document. It's quite kind of heavy in its writing, quite aggressive again, and he actually calls the Duke of Sussex a tyrant, and that's strong word, really, considering that you've just had the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and there was all these kind of radicals going on in working class areas.
Sure.
So I think on one hand, I would have liked to have been, a rebel and fought against that kind of the class issues and stood up for my rights. But I can also see Michael Alexander Gage has been a bit of a bully and being a bit of a touchy kind of person. You've got to do it his way, and there's no other,
Right.
And I think I wouldn't have been comfortable with that, maybe. So, and indeed, there were a few rebels that kind of drifted away from him quite early on. They kind of backed out at the last minute. There was a guy called James Broadhurst who fought with Nelson. He was on a flagship, Nelson's flagship, and he came back to Liverpool after fighting with Nelson. Obviously, he was treated as a bit of a hero because of his connection with Nelson, and he was a watchmaker in Liverpool, and he was well into the rebellion at the early stages. He was at the majority of the meetings. He was there with Gage and the rest of the characters. Yet, when they set up the Grand Lodge in 1823, he wasn't there, he apologised to the United Grand Lodge a year later. So he went back to the United Grand Lodge. So there were a few like that, and I think, I would have liked to have stood up for my rights and stood up, for what I believed in. But then again, maybe Gage was a bit too much of a strong character and a firebrand, so I might have edged my bets, really. I don't know.
Sure, very persuasive fellow, it seems.
So,
awesome.
But I mean, it's an interesting time, though. Very, very interesting. Crosses over to social history and also on a bigger stage. On the world Masonic stage, if you like. It also shows that sometimes Freemasons don't get on as well, and there are problems, and there's trouble and disagreements. And it's not all about brotherly love, there are fractures and so I think there's a bigger lesson to be learned as well, So when I was convincing the publisher that it's not just about local history, I was trying to put forward that there was bigger issues there, And they do say that history repeats itself sometimes.
Oh, definitely so. And I'm very glad that you're able to convince the publisher of that, because even in facts of being local history, it ends up having a major influence on Masonry as a whole. So I think it's a wealth of knowledge, and we're definitely all very grateful that you took the time to resource this material into the wonderful book that you did. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So it's that's one of my favourite books that I've done, actually. It's really enjoyed researching that, and it's one of those books that you're kind of most proud of, really.
Oh, sure, rightfully so. Well, thank you so much for your time tonight. I want to wish you luck. It sounds like you have your anniversary for your lodge coming up this year, so that's an amazing feat to be around that long. That's some history that we definitely want to keep alive. But thank you so much for your time and your wealth of knowledge on this subject, and we hope to have you back on again soon.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the invite, Alex, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Not a problem at all.
All right. Well, I really hope you enjoyed the first interview of the show. As you can tell, Dr. Harrison really knows what he's talking about and brings a lot of knowledge to the table. So I encourage you to check him out farther. We'll have links to his pages and website on our website, historicallight.com, under the post for today's show. So check that out and pick up a copy of his book on today's subject. You can really get a deeper understanding of the events that occurred and really relive that history. Now, if you would like to come on the show, or someone you know, to share some historical light either on your family history, your lodge, or just a subject that you're passionate about in the regards to Masonry, let us know, and we'd love to schedule you to get you on the show. If you haven't done so already, give this show a thumbs up, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and find us on Facebook at Historical Light and like us there to keep up with us. We're also on other social media platforms, and if there's a platform that we're not on, please let us know, and we'd love to set that up so it's most convenient for you. We also have the audio podcast version that is in works. We'll be bringing that soon, so keep an eye out for that. We'll give you some updates as soon as we get a little farther on that. I want to thank you again for joining us today, and hope to see you next time as we continue our quest for historical light.